In response to the unprecedented counteroffensive launched by militant groups in Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared last Tuesday that Israel, quote, didn't start the war, but it will finish it. But how accurate is this statement? In order to answer this question, we need to go back to 1948, when the Gaza Strip was claimed by Egypt, the Arab-Israeli War. Over 200,000 Palestinians who had been ethnically cleansed from their homes sought refuge there. In fact, the vast majority of Gaza's population today are direct descendants from those early refugees. In 1967, Israeli occupation forces then occupied the territory following the Six-Day War. Here, Israel's designs to cleanse the area of its Palestinian population began to take concrete form. Then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol declared that he was concerned with emptying the strip as quickly as possible. He then tasked Edo Sereni to covertly facilitate migration out of Gaza. I don't care where they go, he told her, even to the moon. Eshkol met with Sereni frequently, often asking her about how many Arabs she had driven out. To put it in his own words, he was struck with panic when he learned that only young men had been migrating while young women chose to stay. And because the infant mortality had begun to decrease in Gaza, he saw the situation as a ticking time bomb in which the indigenous Palestinian population would only continue to grow, which could erupt in a demographic catastrophe for a settler ethno-state. We should also say that while some refugees indeed did technically leave of their own volition, they were required to sign documents that stipulated that they could never return there without a permit. Perhaps filled with regret over their decision, hundreds of erstwhile migrants tried to slip back into Palestine, only to be confronted by the armed Israeli patrols that were established to bar them from coming back. For the next 20 years, Israel began a process of economic colonization of Gaza. Limits on private and public investments in key sectors of Palestinian markets curtailed any substantial growth, as did exhaustive restrictions on the importation of new machinery and raw materials. What little was left of their productive economy was allocated to the occupiers, with exports to Western nations being strictly prohibited. Meanwhile, all restrictions from imports on Israel were lifted, thus filling the gap left by commodities that were no longer being domestically produced. As settlers began to pour in and claimed nearly one-third of the land for themselves, the military administration overseeing the Gaza Strip quickly implemented policies that fostered their own agriculture, granting them greater access to water than their Palestinian neighbors. This decimated local food production and absorbed many Palestinian farmers into an unskilled labor force, one which was very quickly exploited by the Israeli occupation. As they began flooding the labor market, they created a quick, desperate group of cheap migrant workers for the interior. All of this created a pernicious cycle of dependency on the Israeli occupation, one which economist Sarah Says has described as de-development. This decimation of Gaza's economy helped sow the seeds for the desolation it would soon inflict upon the Strip. This order was upheld through a system of military occupation, with varying degrees of outright severity. Israeli historian Ilan Pape described the first 20 years of Gaza's occupation as the open prison model, in which Palestinian life in the Strip was heavily regulated and restricted, while still possessing some limited freedoms. While they were still an occupied people under an oppressive regime, they still enjoyed access to some basic necessities. However, this proved to be a ticking time bomb, as the veneer of peaceful subjugation was soon shattered by the First Intifada. Palestinians understood that they had to hit the occupying entity where it hurt them the most. They burnt imported Israeli products, refused to pay taxes to the civil administration, and created their own form of self-government. Israel went into overdrive to quell the uprising, implementing an iron fist policy which instructed soldiers to break the limbs of protesters and assassinate any important organizers. All of these measures backfired, as they only strengthened the resolve of the popular Palestinian movement. As Israel lost control of the situation, they were effectively forced into peace talks with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which culminated with the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. Despite ostensibly establishing a Palestinian state, the terms from Oslo did little to fundamentally improve the lives of Palestinians on the ground. They failed to address the matter of the return of refugees and legitimize the occupation beyond the 1967 borders. All of this effectively perpetuated, and in some cases legitimized, the colonialism that the First Intifada was meant to overthrow. With little done to redress their grievances and the continued colonization of the West Bank and Gaza, a second Intifada erupted in the latter half of the year 2000. Many of the same tactics that had brought Israel to the table during the First Intifada were utilized, such as boycotts, civil disobedience, and mass protests. The response from the colonial entity was vastly more brutal, with occupation soldiers summarily executing protesters for daring to demonstrate. This was met with even more militant reprisals from the Palestinian resistance, who quickly learned that armed force was the only language the occupation understood. The resistance from freedom fighters in Gaza was so fierce that Israel actually withdrew its troops from the Strip in 2005, While this moment has been cast as a kind of gesture of goodwill from the settler colony, their own rationale behind the decision tells a different story. According to Dov Weissglass, the top aide of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, the retreat from Gaza was meant to be a formaldehyde to the Palestinian cause. It gave the occupation a bargaining chip in any discussions about new settlements or territories, because now they could say that they had so selflessly relinquished the Gaza Strip in a mass sacrifice for peace. By design, this maneuver obstructed any political overtures to Palestinian liberation. It's important to note that, by any other measure, Israel never truly stopped occupying Gaza. While it no longer has boots on the ground, it still heavily restricts everyday life for those who reside there. The settler state has used resistance activity and other political developments to strengthen these measures against the Strip, imposing a total and complete blockade of land, air, and sea. Imports, exports, and freedom of movement are all subject to some of the most draconian restrictions in modern history. The security fence that Israel erected around the border is so militarized that some experts have called Gaza the world's largest open air prison. Israeli occupation forces have also hindered domestic food production, with 35% of agricultural land and 85% of its fishing waters being completely inaccessible. Israel had already de-developed Gaza's economy through colonization, and now they're doing whatever they can to ensure that it never develops again. This has led to a humanitarian crisis, with poverty and malnutrition running rampant throughout the Strip. Even attempts from international bodies and NGOs to ameliorate these conditions are often blocked by Israeli authorities. All of these are hallmark characteristics of a city under siege. All of this is to say nothing of the relentless bombing campaigns that Israel carries out on Gaza as a form of collective punishment whenever tensions break out. Not only are the people there effectively held captive within the borders, but they're at constant risk of being either displaced or killed by airstrikes at any moment. So, once again, let's ask the question: who started this war, and why? If you'd like to support any organizations trying to bring humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, we'll include some links in our description. And if you would like to support us, please consider buying a subscription to the International magazine and like and subscribe. Thank you.